So what we're going to do now is go ahead and start talking about groups. And I'm actually a groups researcher, so it's a little bit unfortunate, frustrating for me. We don't get to spend as much time on this, but again, we kind of had to divide things up a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're really going to be talking about groups, and we're going to highlight quite a bit how groups are so critical in terms of what we're doing right now, dealing with the coronavirus, how groups are making decisions that are important for us, and kind of highlighting too that for one of the first times, I think in a long time, we actually can think of the globe as kind of this larger group, because we now have such a strong shared consequence of trying to combat the coronavirus. Now, when we've talked about concepts so far, it's been pretty straightforward, but we're going to see here when we talk about groups, it's not quite that case. But one of the first things to think about, and one of the reasons why I love groups especially, is that we often spend our time in groups. I think if you take a step back, you think about how often we are in groups, and you think about too, now that we're not, now that we just have groups like this, we're not in kind of face-to-face groups, you're not meeting with groups kind of nearly as much as you're used to, you can think about the impact we have of not being part of groups, not being able to interact with others. I must admit, it's cracking me up watching TV shows now because there's all kinds of scenarios where people are in groups that we can't be in groups now. So you're watching a show where they got together and did a flash mob in a courtyard. You would never imagine that happening right now. That group connection, that group experience isn't there. And so you can think about groups in terms of their importance and what they do. You can also think about what happens when we're not able to be in groups, or it's more difficult to be in groups. So when we talk about groups, it gets a bit tricky because we don't have a clear definition of groups. Okay, so I'm going to go through this a bit quickly for you guys. If you don't get down all the notes, don't sweat it too much. But the idea here is that we're going to talk about groups in a way that shows that it's kind of complex to understand exactly what they are. So some concepts are really straightforward, others are less so. Now, the textbook here is going to define a group as a collection of at least two people who are doing or being something together. Okay, so the textbook definition is a collection of at least two people who are doing or being something together. Now, groups researchers would argue that this isn't necessarily a group. It's in fact what we call a specialized group, which is called a dyad. And we call it not necessarily a group because if one group member leaves, if one of the two people in that dyad leaves, it's no longer a group. So some group researchers might say, well, a group is at least a minimum of 3 people. It's a minimum of 3 people because at least then if one person leaves, that group still remains. In this case, if one person leaves, then it's just one individual being left. So this definition doesn't quite sit well. So how else can we think about defining a group? So McGrath focused rather on just kind of giving us a number-based definition. Instead, well, let's think about the dynamics of a group. Let's think about the dynamics, relationships in group. The first is that you might say a group is in fact a group if the individuals that are in there, in that group experience, have a potential for interaction. Okay, so are they able to communicate with each other, socially influence each other, things we were just talking about? Okay, are they able to communicate with each other, be with each other? That means that there's a potential for interaction. So that defines that in fact is a group. Okay, if you have individuals who are not going to be able to interact with each other, you wouldn't say that that's a group. It's a collection of individuals. Are they mutually aware of each other? Okay, so do they know of each other's presence? Do they know of each other's influences? Okay, are they recognizing the other person? The third piece here is, are they interdependent? And by interdependent, what I mean here is, are they connected in terms of, is the outcome shared with them? Okay. Is their fate, how one person is responding, influencing the fate of someone else? Okay. Are they engaging and interacting with each other in terms of things all coming out together? Okay, so that's kind of one way of thinking about interdependence. The last piece that McGrath talks about is this idea of a history or an anticipated future. So is it a collection of individuals that have done things together? You know, so there's some past history, some of the things that we're talking about in terms of interdependence are starting to be built up. Or do they anticipate a future together? Okay, so, you know, is it something the case that they do anticipate they're going to be interacting with each other, their outcomes are going to be related to each other, they're going to be working together on things. And we can take kind of almost any collection of individuals and evaluate, are they a group? Okay, so you know, one of the ones I like to think about was when I would take this trolley type bus back and forth from campus to where I lived in downtown Lafayette, West Lafayette. Actually Lafayette, downtown Lafayette. And so we took this trolley thing, and I'd always kind of sit there while I was waiting saying, well, is this really a group? Can we make an argument that this collection of people standing here waiting to go on this trolley to get across the river, to go home or to do touristy or commercial kind of things. Is this a group? Well, we do have a potential for interaction, so we could talk to each other. We could be engaging with each other. We all had to line up to get on the bus. We were mutually aware of each other, so you we're kind of positioning yourself relative to other people, giving them space, but being aware when the bus was coming. When the bus was coming, everyone kind of moved to get on. We were interdependent in the fact that we all wanted to get to some place together. We were interdependent in terms of, if someone was slow to get on the bus, that held up everyone else. But we can start to say, well, is that really a group though? Because we had no past history. We just showed up at that moment. We're waiting maybe 10 minutes to get on the bus. And we have really no anticipated future. Once we get done with that loop of the bus ride, we're gone. That's it. Okay, now there did start to become a specific group that actually started to get on the bus at the same time together. So we actually did get a chance to kind of know each other after a while. So you can take some of this criteria in terms of what Graf says and say, hey, is this a group? Now, other researchers, of course, offer different perspectives. One way that we can think about groups is in terms of entitativity. Okay, so if you want a tongue twister, a word to practice on, work on entitativity. And entitativity is this idea of looking at how much a perceived unit has a degree of kind of groupness. Okay, so again, this is where it gets kind of tricky because the definition of groups is not super clear. It's not straightforward like we've had with kind of other things. But again, it has similar kind of characteristics or evaluation as McGrath does. So does the group have a common fate? Okay, so is the outcome kind of be similar for everyone in that group? Are the individuals similar? So it might be in terms of their characteristics, both physical or social. And is there proximity? So is the group kind of close to each other? Okay. This proximity could be either physical, or you guys can demonstrate proximity in this case, but you guys are all coming together at the exact same time to work on the exact same thing. Okay, so you can kind of say, well, how is this proximity different than what it would be in the classroom? And so one of the ways, again, that we can evaluate if a group is in fact a group is by this kind of vague concept of groupness. So evaluating how much a group has a common fate, how similar the individuals are, and their proximity. So one of the things I kind of debate now is with the coronavirus, how does that influence kind of thinking about the world as a group? Now, usually we don't think about the world as a group because, individuals are so different across all different cultures and places on the continent. There's very little similarity, and there's very little proximity, and in fact, there's very little common fate. Okay, so each country has kind of a different outcome for their citizens. But in our case, we start to see with the coronavirus that there is starting to become a common fate. Okay, so we're all collectively across the world working towards trying to keep this virus from spreading. So does that start to increase, I should say, the entitativity of kind of the world as a whole? Is there a higher degree of groupness? Now, what I'll let you guys do is kind of practice and think about this in terms of where do these groups fit on the continuum? Okay, so that's one way to kind of process and think about groups is to think about, well, when we take something like an intimacy group, such as a family, are they high in entitativity? Okay, what criteria do they meet in terms of being part of a group? Okay, if we take something like a gender group, okay, how do they fit along this continuum? Where do you start to see them as kind of having more of a common fate, similarity, and where do they start to kind of fall apart on these dimensions? So we've talked about kind of this overarching idea that the definition of groups is kind of tricky. Okay, so I want to keep that in mind, but let me kind of pause at this point, see what questions you have now that we've kind of defined at least some idea of what groups are before we start talking about kind of what groups do and kind of what their functions are. So let me pause at this point. Again, if you're all good, let me know. Otherwise, jump in with a question. I'll make sure that at least we're as clear as we can be with kind of these vague definitions we're working with. All right. Okay, so it seems like we're good. I appreciate you responding. If you do have video cam, you're willing to turn it on, please do that. I'm kind of trying to keep an eye on you guys to kind of make sure we're not going too fast or too slow. So more of you guys are kind of on with cams. It's kind of helpful for me to kind of keep pace with things because there's a lot I want us to cover. I want to make sure we're doing a good job with it as well. Okay, so that being said, jump on the camera if you have one, if you're willing to. Otherwise, let's go ahead and start talking about part 2. So part 2 starts to ask this question, well, what do groups do? We spend so much time in groups, and there's a reason for that. So the reason for that is because groups do a whole bunch of things for our well-being, kind of helping us out and helping us function. So I want to focus on what those things are in terms of what groups do. So the first thing that groups do is they give us an identity and they keep us from depression and suicide. The idea here is that we form groups that we want to be part of that support our self-esteem, support our well-being. So, I have a strong connection. We have a strong connection in the psychology department, where that's just a group that we identify with. We identify as psychologists, kind of all working together to help students be successful, to do successful research. We support each other quite a bit. And so by having that identity, it bolsters kind of our well-being. And we'll talk about this here in just a little bit of a moment. And because of these strong social ties, we see that this reduces the risk of suicide. The reason why this is the case is that groups help us fulfill these kind of basic fundamental needs. And one of these basic fundamental needs that we have that is supported by groups is this connection and this love and belonging. Okay, so if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, we see that about the third level up, that groups start to help us fulfill this sense of love and belonging. And Baumeister and Leary say that we need this regular social contact. We need these stable, ongoing, intimate relationships in order for us to be successful, to fulfill this need, in order to allow us to take on bigger challenges, like things that challenge our self-esteem, or working towards the self-actualization, which you guys are doing. So putting all this together a little bit with what's currently going on now, groups help us do a bunch of different things. The first is that groups will help us with our physiological needs. Okay? They help us provide resources, shelter, food, sleep. If we don't have this satisfied, we're not able to work on higher level things within our needs. So that's why you'll notice that schools right now are making sure that the students are still getting food. Okay, knowing that a lot of these kids don't have food options when they get home, that they were relying on schools to provide food for them on a daily basis. At EV school, everyone is offered breakfast in the morning. Okay? And the reason why that's outstanding is because children are not going to be able to learn. They're not going to be able to maintain their behavior, to be able to do anything successful socially if they're hungry. Okay, same thing in terms of providing clothes for the students. If they don't have these basic physiological needs, they can't be successful. Okay? The second level of Maslow's hierarchy needs, this idea of safety and security. So in this case, we want individuals to have a safe place to be, family, the social stability. We want their health to be taken care of. And this is something that's currently most at risk for everyone. Okay, so both of these two levels are ones that are being threatened by the coronavirus, making it hard to do anything else. Okay, so when I was out for my run yesterday, I was thinking about, well, how are you guys supposed to learn and understand these influence tactics and get into the details of social psychology if you're worried about basic things like getting the resources you need or having the safety and security? I understand that these are things that now, because of the virus, are more at stake for many students. And again, the university has resources. If you're in this position, let me know. I can help you out. In our case, focusing on groups help us with this love and belonging. And so individuals want to be part of groups. They want to interact with each other. That's where you see all these kind of groups where people are coming out and clapping for first responders at the same time to try to have this larger group feeling. The happy hours on Zoom where, there's 12 people on a screen and everyone's, drinking beers and talking with each other, trying to replicate that kind of group interaction. These larger Facebook groups, they're talking about Facebook is taking on a larger role because people are trying to connect with each other. Zoom is blown up in terms of starting to create these groups and group interactions. All this is in a service for being able to communicate and being part of larger groups. And one of the things that you're seeing is that there's some individuals that the desire to be connected with others is kind of overriding managing this risk of the coronavirus. So they keep going out, they keep interacting, even though it's better for them to stay in. And one of the things I was talking about with Katie last night is that for us to be successful, I think one of the things we need to do is acknowledge the fact that we're evolutionally evolved to need to be around others, and we need to find a way to be able to do that in a healthy, safe fashion. Okay, we need to get safety equipment to first responders to help those who are sick, but the next wave needs to be being able to get us back together in a safe, healthy way, because at some point we're just going to need to fulfill this connection with others, and it's going to have people going back out again. This is just a primary drive that we have. Okay, so we kind of talked about a lot of different pieces here, but this idea is that by having these connections, by being around others, connecting with others, this reduces our risk of suicide because it fulfills this love and belonging. That's why you're seeing a lot more kind of social support going out, a lot more mental health resources, because individuals are at a higher risk for depression and suicidal behavior because they aren't getting these direct connections that they're needing. They're getting isolated because they have to stay at home because they're maybe on their own. They're not able to connect with others. So we see that groups play a critical role in this regard. I'm going to pause just for a moment because there's lots of info here. See if you have any questions or things I can clarify before we'll continue talking about what groups do. So I think this is probably the biggest thing, especially from the research that I do, about why we focus on groups. Why are groups so important for us? The other reason why we have groups is that groups provide us with information. Okay, so this is why when you're making decisions, we want to work at least to some degree in groups. And we do see good things happen with groups. We'll also talk about the limitations of working with groups. So here's an example of results from a previous study that I did within a group, a previous kind of class demo. And let me explain how this works. In our top line here, we had participants or students report as a group to everyone in class how long a certain amount of time went by. So I asked students to indicate how long a time went by, and for both conditions, both the group and the individual, 45 seconds went by. Okay, so I basically started a stopwatch in class. After 45 seconds went by, in the group condition, I said, tell me what your estimate was. In the individual condition, I asked students to write down what their response was. And if you look at our group versus our individual results, you see that the range for the group is smaller, meaning that the group, when they work together, they're seeing information from others, has a smaller range of what it is. We see that the mean is more accurate as well. Okay, so it's about 51 seconds here. The actual answer is 45. We see two related to the range. The standard deviation is lower. When individuals are working on their own, they're less precise. So this is where we can use groups to inform us, to give us information, to help us hopefully become more accurate. Now, they used to have in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire the option of polling the audience. And of all the options, I think it was phone a friend, poll the audience. I forget what the third one was. But the one that was most successful, researchers found, was when the contestant polled the audience. And in fact, audiences eventually figured this out, and they started actually messing with the contestants and giving the wrong answer. Okay, so for a while, it's the best way to respond. Eventually, groups figured out, that this is going on. They actually started giving incorrect answers, so the variability went back up again. So it became a less helpful tactic. So the punchline, though, of this particular slide is talking about the fact that groups provide us information that help us be more accurate and help us make better decisions. Now, we also see that groups provide norms. Okay, so this is something else that we're seeing as being critically important for the coronavirus, is establishing social standards of what people ought to do. Let me fix ought here real quick. Oops. All right, so what people ought to do. Make it a little clearer for you guys. So this idea is that we have norms that we establish, and then we want to follow these norms. And that's one of the biggest pieces right now, is trying to establish these norms of social distancing. Okay, so it becomes kind of commonplace. I saw a picture of people lined up at the FedEx store, and you can see that they were following this social norm of standing away from each other. Okay, so there's that 6-foot separation. Normally you'd see everyone kind of not necessarily right on top of each other, but pretty closely following each other in line. In this case, we saw that they were following this norm of having that 6-foot distance. So it was great to see. It was great to see that that norm was being applied, even in this kind of situation where it could be easily forgotten. We also had this weird experience, but there's so many things that there's norms not in place. So part of what's tough about our transition online is that what are our norms now going to be? What's acceptable for students to be doing? What are acceptable reasons why they can't make it to class? What are the norms for now giving exams? All these norms, these social standards, start to become things that need to be reestablished again. Now with groups, there's certain types of norms that we can think about. So some basic types of norms are what we call injunctive and descriptive norms. Okay. So injunctive norms are what people either approve of or disapprove of. Okay. So you disapprove of students failing a class. You disapprove of students wasting their parents' money on education. Okay. So this is something that people disapprove of. It's very clear it's kind of going against these kind of values, these morals, these rules. There's also a different type of norm in terms of descriptive norm. Yeah, this descriptive norm is what most people do. Okay, so we might say, well, it's not appropriate to fail a class, We might say the descriptive norm is that students work as hard as they can in the class and kind of do the best they can to get a grade, but maybe they don't spend all the time studying. We can see this in terms of speed limit signs. The injunctive norm is the speed limit that's set. Okay, so going above that speed limit is disapproved of. Okay, going below that speed limit is an approved behavior. We can see those speed limit signs, are ones where there's still a little bit of a descriptive norm. So what do most people do? Okay, well, most people, let's say, drive 5 miles over the speed limit. Okay, so even that starts to become, well, that's okay, that's approved of, because that's kind of what people normally do. But it goes against potentially what we say is that kind of that injunctive norm. That injunctive norm is how people should approve or what they would approve of or disapprove of. Okay? So in thinking about this, okay, what are some examples of injunctive norms and descriptive norms? And I'll say, actually, Dr. Kowalski and I were actually working on a research study where we thought about injunctive and descriptive norms related to the coronavirus. Okay, we talked about, what people ought to be doing, so that 6-foot distance, washing their hands all the time. But then also, what are the descriptive norms? What are most people doing? Okay, well, they're maybe sometimes keeping their social distance, or they're keeping their social distance around strangers, but not necessarily around family. So what are some examples of injunctive norms and descriptive norms? Okay, so you jump in again, either by chiming in on chat or sharing your response to the microphone. Okay, and let's collect a few of these here.
For one of my classes, I have the option to either like join a Zoom or not to, and it's like 1 point a day. So you're either gaining a point or losing a point.
Okay.
And this class is like pretty large. Like there's typically like, I would say upwards of like 40 people maybe in this class.
Okay.
And on Zoom, there's like 15 people.
Okay.
So I guess the injunctive would be like I would approve of like doing the Zoom and gaining the point.
Okay.
Most people are not joining.
Okay, so great example, fits in really well. So stay with me. This idea here, that kind of that injunctive, that what you should approve of is being in class. That's kind of what the expectation is. We see the descriptive norm is that most people aren't coming to class on time. This is why, again, I appreciate you guys being here. You created a great norm of being on class on time. So I think this is a great example. Okay, let's get kind of one or two. Either again, you can kind of touch on one of these or kind of both these together. Other examples of injunctive or descriptive norms.
I just thought of one that's like reading a book. So the descriptive norm is like reading it from beginning to end, like normally.
Okay.
But an injunctive norm where someone would disapprove is when you read the last page first and then read the rest.
Okay, so very nice. So you can think about that too in terms of like a movie. People disapprove of sharing kind of spoilers at the end, things like that. That's not okay. But the norm is like, well, maybe they share a little bit of it. Okay, maybe they kind of tease at it. So same thing with kind of book, reading it at the end, just kind of jumping ahead. Okay, so I like that example. Okay, let's pick up one more. I'll actually share one that I just kind of think of, the injunctive norm with teaching is, that you're making eye contact, that you're engaging students, that you're kind of going back and forth with students. And I think what's interesting is that that's kind of the injunctive norm, but especially when we get into an online context, that descriptive norm starts to become a little different, where that goal is still there, but the descriptive norm is kind of like, now you see professors looking around all over the place. I don't know if you guys are noticing this, but I definitely feel it. I want to make eye contact, you guys are being engaged, but I also have other screens open over here just so that I can see what you guys are seeing to track what's going on. I'm looking at the chat over here, seeing who's in and out. I'm scrolling through to see, who's with me, kind of checking in on you guys. So it's really kind of weird, because usually when you lecture, you're focused only on one thing. That's kind of what, you're really, the injunctive norm is, but the descriptive norm now is kind of, well, you're checking out kind of multiple things. That kind of becomes more okay if you see kind of people doing different things when they're meeting, even students, kind of moving around doing different things. That's something that wouldn't be approved of in the classroom, but the norm's a little different now when we're online. So again, as you're studying, as you're processing, think about things. Think about these injunctive norms, think about these descriptive norms, apply them to things going on right around you, because they're seeing all kinds of norms kind of being changed and addressed. Okay? So let's continue on in terms of talking about groups too, because this is something actually going to tie into a conversation I had with Katie just last night about coronavirus issues. Now, one of the things that happens with these norms is that groups will start to police these norms. And you can see this kind of being established already. So the norm is starting to become that you should stay away from others, that you should have this 6-foot distance, that you shouldn't be gathering in large groups. And if you watch or listen to some of the news, you'll see that groups that are violating this are getting called out. So there was a pastor in a church, I forget which state it was, but he got arrested because he kept having his congregation meet. And it was made like kind of national news that he was getting everyone together, that he was violating the stay-at-home kind of rule. And so you could see that we were policing that group norm. In other Asian cultures, they even get into public shaming. Okay, so if you take your dog out and your dog poops and you don't clean it up, that they'll go online and find you and shame you for not having cleaned up after your dog. Okay, so they're policing that norm that you should be picking up, after your dog. Now, according to Diker and Kuhlman, there's several things that we do to police these group norms. The first is that we might try to repair that relationship. So the idea here is that when you have someone who's deviant, is that you might respond to them with kind of trying to negotiate with them. Okay, so how can you kind of reconcile what's going on? So you might punish them, hoping that changes their behavior. So kind of put them in timeout, take away resources for them, pay them less. You might forgive them saying, hey, you really didn't do your part of the group work, but that's okay. I understand things you have going on. That's all right. You might negotiate with them. You might work towards reintegrating them. The idea here is that when someone isn't following that norm, you try to work through it with them to get them kind of back in line. Okay, so even with my in-laws, they really are kind of older, they have health issues, and especially when virus things are first starting to come out, the suggestion to stay at home was starting to come out, they kept going out all over the place. We had to kind of be like, look, stay home, take care of yourself, let's adjust this behavior because you don't want you guys to get sick. So that's one way when we have these norms being violated is we try to repair. Okay? The second way that we think about dealing with group norms is that we might stigmatize the individual. And so the idea here is that if we can't repair that relationship, if we can't make it better, then potentially we want to stigmatize that person. We want to kind of give them a sense of kind of lower value. We want them to kind of question their actions. And the idea here is that stigmatization leads to being excluded. Okay, so if someone has a facial disfigurement, different races that are stigmatizing, these type of things start to give kind of lower credibility to that person, kind of lower evaluation of that person, which puts them in a more perilous position to be excluded. Okay, so there's certain groups that we can identify as being stigmatized, such as individuals who are overweight, and they get excluded. They're less likely to be offered jobs, less likely to be given housing. They're perceived as going to school, or less actually likely to have parents support them going to school because they don't think it's worth the student's time if they're overweight. So you see how the stigmatization starts to carry with it kind of exclusionary behaviors. Okay? Now the last piece of this, okay, is in some cases we just have to tolerate that group member. Okay, so there's cases where we have a bad group member who's not following that norm. And the idea here is you have to kind of suppress and control the negative responses to that individual. Okay, so we've all had that group member who's not doing their part, not getting things done on time, kind of dragging the group down. Maybe they're distracting the group. You might have tried to repair that relationship, trying to get them to kind of come back in line, punish them, negotiate with them, saying, hey, I need your part of the assignment. If you can at least give me an outline of your part of the paper, that would be helpful. You might have tried to stigmatize them. So saying, hey, you're not really being a good group member, you're not really a great student, trying to get them to kind of repair things potentially if they can, aim at excluding them. Or it might come down to the fact that you just have that group member that you have to tolerate. This might be that coworker that, you just kind of don't get along with. And so this ties into a conversation I had with Katie last night. I made the argument to her that what we have to do is kind of be more forward thinking, and we need to figure out how to develop devices that allow us to be out in the environment, to engage with others, but protect ourselves. So breathing apparatus, masks, things like that, so that we can actually start engaging with each other again. That is the safest way for us to reduce the coronavirus incidents, because we're not going to be able to keep from seeing each other. But if we're going to have to see each other, let's do it in a safe way. And this is just kind of an idea I had, kind of a thought I had. And Katie said, well, what about people that don't want to wear these masks, or they're going out and interacting without kind of following these guidelines? I thought, that's a great question, because that's really the hitch in this plan. And my instant response, whether it was a good one or not, was that you'd stigmatize them. Okay, so much like you'd stigmatize others for doing poor behaviors, not following group norms, you might say, well, you stigmatize others who are not wearing that mask. Let's say, kind of going out and imagining the future. So, you're going into a classroom, everyone has their masks on, but a few students don't. Okay, maybe they decide they don't want to, wear the goofy mask or whatever it would be. And you might say, we're going to stigmatize them. So you're going to say, well, we're not interacting with you, you're unhealthy, or you're unclean. You could be getting me sick. And so those individuals, because of the threat of exclusion, because they're not following norms, might change their behavior, might go along with the group and wear these masks. Okay, so it starts to become, again, individuals, or groups, I should say, start policing themselves, like Diker and Kuhlman suggest here. Okay. So let me pause here to see what questions you have. Kind of brought in a whole bunch of different things related to kind of policing groups and group norms. Let me pause at this point, see what questions you have, or if you want to add on to this as well. So if you had kind of other thoughts, maybe related to these things, whether it be just now or previously. So I'll give you guys just a moment to chime in with any questions or thoughts. All right. Okay, seems like we're doing okay. Okay. Not if you guys are still all right. Still with me. I know we're working our way through a lot of information here, so I appreciate you guys hanging in there with me. There's kind of the cost of spending a little more time on social influence, and just because of other things you have going on. Okay. So let's talk too about what happens with groups. Okay. So one of the things I think is really fascinating about groups is this idea of social facilitation. And the overarching idea behind the social facilitation is that the presence of others increases our dominant response to a task. Okay, so social facilitation is this idea that the presence of others, so others being around, increases our dominant response to a task. Okay, so let's work our way through this. And to some degree, working our way through this, we're actually going all the way back to day one. Okay, so one of the first studies that I would argue, at least, and others would potentially agree with me, that was done within social psychology was Triplett study, okay, Norman Triplett. And what he found is when he looked at bicyclist times, okay, and bike races, that bicyclists performed better, meaning they were faster, when they were racing with others compared to when they were doing time trials. Okay, so in bicycling, you do time trials to establish your seating position, and then from there, they then race. So then they're racing with others. Now you might think, well, hey, if you're racing with others, that's a bit trickier because those others are influencing you, potentially getting in your way, changing the environment around you. It's a much more controlled environment when you're riding alone compared to with others. So it seems kind of counterintuitive. So Triplett actually went into the lab and he looked at, the speed and how fast bicyclists were going when they were with others, with a group, or by themselves. And so Triplett made the argument that the presence of others causes us to perform better. And so this again is based on just observation, things going on around him, and just having a keen eye. And that's a big part of just being a good social psychologist. And it's what I hope you guys are developing, especially as we think about what's going on with the coronavirus, is just making good observations of things going on around you. So much is changing. There's all kinds of things to think about. Now, Zion said, well, hey, it's not necessarily that having others around makes you better. How many have had experiences where with others around, you do worse at something? So how many of you want to avoid giving a public speech? Okay, you'd rather give that speech in your bedroom alone. And part of the reason why that is that the presence of others then influences how we're responding. And so what Zion's argued is that it's not necessarily that the presence of others makes you better at a task, but rather it pulls out your dominant response. Okay, so however you're going to perform on that task is exacerbated by the presence of others. Okay. So what he argued, and this kind of diagram at the bottom here does a nice job kind of walking us through things, is the competitive or evaluation presence of others increases arousal level. So you get kind of more anxious, you get more on that fight or flight response. You're physiologically becoming kind of more aroused, that the presence of others starts to do this. And what this does is it increases the likelihood of a dominant response. Okay, so that dominant response is basically saying, this is the response that you normally have. Okay? If you're very good at something, having others around causes you to be better. Okay? If you do poorly at something, so kind of over here, we're going to see that having others around makes it worse for you. Okay, so your dominant response, whether you're successful or unsuccessful at a task previously, having others around only drives you towards one of those two directions. Okay, so increased performance is caused on things that you're well versed at when you have others around. However, when you're not very good at something, you want to do it on your own. You don't want others around. So one of the things I always find really fascinating is I'll tell others and tell students that I actually miss teaching to big classes. Okay, so it's nice to get to know you guys, to be able to interact with you more, to get to know your names, kind of know things are going on in your lives around you. I really do love that, but I miss lecturing to that lecture hall of 150 students. Okay, so at North Florida, I used to do that. And I keep thinking about, well, why is that the case? And what it was is that I like that increased arousal by having more people around. Okay, so because I love lecturing, I love having more people around because it increases my arousal level, causes me to perform better. Okay, I think that's one of the things that's toughest lecturing in my office at home is that there's no one around. Okay, I'd love to be able to compare Dave Matthews' performance was just him in front of a mirror compared to if he had been singing those exact same songs in front of the thousands of people that he normally sings in front of. But there's times though when we're not very good at something that having other people around only makes it worse. Okay, so I was thinking about this with playing in the student staff basketball game. So a game we got in just before all the lockdown stuff started happening. And I was thinking about, I was like, I play basketball all the time. What makes this game that much different? And for me, it was the fact that other people would be around. So now it's going to increase my dominant response. My dominant response is to suck. Okay? And so we can think about this scenario. Okay? If we think about Kobe and Shaq shooting free throws. Okay? So Kobe, the late, great Kobe, was excellent at shooting free throws. Okay? And Shaq, on the other hand, was notorious for how bad he was shooting free throws. Okay, I think at one point he might have been shooting underhanded. Okay? In what scenario do we want Kobe shooting, and in what scenario do we want Shaq shooting? Okay, so think about this with or without a crowd. What's the ideal combination if we want both of them to shoot at an optimal amount? Okay, to perform at their best. What's the situation we want them to have related to the crowd? Okay, so go ahead and jump in with what do you think is the best situation for Kobe? What's the best situation for Shaq?
We would want Kobe to have the crowd because they would kind of like hype him up and stuff, and then Shaq to have without a crowd because he's already bad. So then they would just make him more nervous.
Okay, so perfect. We got that response. Mackenzie's jumping in, agreeing with you, saying Kobe with a crowd, Shaq without. So you're absolutely right. It gets to the point at the end of the game's on the line. We want the crowd to go nuts for Kobe. Okay, in fact, you probably almost want to taunt him, kind of based on his personality characteristics. But for Shaq, we want it super quiet. In fact, if everyone just wants to leave the building, that's what we want to see. And in some cases, you even see this in football, where at different points they'll, help raise their hands, the quarterback will, to increase kind of, or defense will, to kind of make things louder, to increase arousal, making it harder for the offense. Alternatively, you see the quarterback, that his fans are fired up, kind of saying, calm down, like be quieter so we can, do things, without that distress. That kind of plays into this facilitation effect. And so researchers actually did some of the weirdest studies to demonstrate this. They actually went to looking at cockroaches to understand it. Okay? Now, I know you guys think I'm a whiz at PowerPoint. You've been blown away at all these well put together PowerPoints. But today we are going to hit some next level PowerPoint. Okay? So I want you guys to pay close attention to how awesome this PowerPoint is as we talk about this particular cockroach study. Okay, so it's very rare that you actually use kind of animals or insects to understand human behavior, but here's one of these rare cases. So what this study involved was having cockroaches go through a maze. Okay, and we know that cockroaches are going to run away from light towards darkness, so they use that to their advantage to motivate these cockroaches to go through this maze. And for the sake of kind of demonstrating things, in the alone condition, a cockroach went through the maze just by himself. Okay, so imagine our cockroach going through like this. Okay, yes, I know you guys are wowed by how awesome that looked. Okay, I know you can't share it as much as you would if we're in the classroom, but I can tell how awesome you think this is. Okay? Now, the other condition they compared it to was the social condition. Okay, so throughout the maze, there's these other cockroaches in little boxes, so meaning that there's that social presence around others. Okay, so cockroaches here are going by, they're going by others. Again, they're going through the maze. Okay? I won't play it again for you guys, but these are downloaded. You can go through the cockroach maze example later on for yourself. Okay? Now, what they did is they had two types of mazes. Okay? They had a simple maze for the cockroach to go through, or they had a complex maze. Okay? So what I want you guys to do is I want you to graph out, okay, what you think the results were for the study. Okay, so basically the outcome you're thinking about is how long it took the cockroaches to get through the maze. Think about the two factors that we have here. So think about this 2x2 design and graph out what you think the results were for the study. Or you can just kind of write down your prediction in terms of how long you think it took when the cockroaches were alone in a simple or a complex maze, okay, or when they were with others, so there's other cockroaches around, kind of the social scenario, when they were either alone or with others. Okay, so I'll give you guys a minute to kind of either graph this out if you want to. I'll present the results of the graph, or at least kind of write down your averages. And so I'll tell you the average time was between 0 and 300 seconds. So you can kind of graph things out based on that. Okay, so I'll give you guys a minute to do that, and then I'll share the results with you. We'll see how close you were. Your predictions are to what the researchers found with these cockroaches. All right, I see you guys putting down your responses, thinking this through. I appreciate you guys doing this. I think this is good practice, good way of kind of thinking about things. See if your thoughts are lined up with what the researchers found. Okay, so give you guys about a few more seconds here. All right, so hopefully you have your responses. Let's go ahead and show you what they found. Okay, so looking at our cockroach study here. Okay. When we look at the simple maze, we see that when they're alone, it took cockroaches a little bit longer, okay, significantly longer though, compared to when they had others around them. When the maze was complex, they actually navigated it faster when they were alone compared to when there was other cockroaches around. So the idea here is when the maze was simple, it's easy for the cockroaches to go through. I don't know if it's a practice behavior for them or not, but it's simple for them to go through. So having others around causes them to be faster at the task. However, when we switch things around, it's a complex maze. This is where that dominant response comes out. And when there's other cockroaches there making a social task, the fact that it's hard for the cockroach to go through, it's a difficult task, causes them to actually take more time compared to if they're alone. Okay, so you can think about this in terms of your responses, your behaviors. In some cases, it's better to do it with others around. It causes you to be that much better. Okay, so I've seen basketball players that when I play kind of one-on-one with them or two-on-two, they're kind of all right. But man, they are totally different players when you get out on the court with all kinds of other players out there. You put fans in front of them. And I've also seen others like me where I do okay on a Thursday night with a few other people. It's no big deal. But when it's a larger stage, as much as I try to negate the fact that I know this is happening, this social facilitation effect, that I still don't perform quite as well. So we talked about what groups do. Let me pause at this point to see if you have questions before I'm going to highlight a couple of pieces of where groups work well and where they don't. Okay, we're going to go through these a bit quickly in terms of these where groups do well and where they don't, but I think they're important things to be considering right now, especially.